I make a bold statement. Fix insulin resistance and you will fix over 20 chronic, fatal, and terminal diseases. You think understanding insulin is important? You bet it definitely is. Most multiple complex chronic diseases have one thing in common as their root cause. Just one thing. Yep, they have insulin resistance. 1 in 3 people are suffering from insulin resistance. More than 1 in 3 people globally, at least 2.5 billion, are pre-diabetic. Now, of these with pre-diabetes, more than 85% don't know they have it. Being pre-diabetic puts you at increased risk of developing all chronic diseases and all cause mortality. And that is why I'm doing this podcast. It is a pandemic. Now, if we take low sex drive as a chronic disease type, it is a basic human right for everyone to have a satisfying sexual life. And science has proven that there is a very steep connection between insulin resistance, multiple diseases, and sexual health. So, what are we talking about today? We are looking at fixing one aspect of our life in order to fix a multiple of diseases. I've done a video titled Disease 2021, which is 20 diseases, 2 years to cure with one root cause. The link is in the description panel below. Please watch that video. It is a 20 minutes, 21 seconds podcast. How interesting! When we understand insulin and reversing insulin resistance, then we could very well have as high as an 85% head start in understanding root causes of metabolic syndromes and all cause mortality. We are going to show you how insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance actually do work. So let's start with a layman's take on what insulin is. What insulin is and why it's such a problem for our body. As we look at insulin resistance, we will need to look at 4 most important cells in our body. 4 out of a possible 10, others being the nerve cells, stem cells, bone cells, blood cells, sperm cells, and female egg cells. We're looking at just 4. So for now, the cells we need to look at are 1, your liver cells, 2, your muscle cells, 3, your fat cells. By this, I also mean adipose cells, which are specialized for the storage of energy in the form of triglycerides. And I choose to include a 4th, which is your brain cells. The brain cells will use that to represent all the other body cells. So every cell in the human body needs energy to survive and to carry out its different functions. So if we're talking about a brain cell, it needs energy to keep stimulating other brain cells and sending on signals and also messages. If it's a muscle cell, it needs energy to contract. If it's a liver cell, it knows that it is part of the largest organ in our body, having over 500 functions. I'm just making a mention of 3 vital functions essential to our body's functioning, which the liver actually carries out. These are detoxification, synthesis, and storage. So you bet the liver cells are very important. If it's a fat cell, fat is so often seen as the enemy, something to avoid or something to lose. I think it's called diet or burnout in gyms or workouts, or taking long fats. Fat is something sold as the enemy, but fat cells are a crucial component of the body. Without it, humans will freeze. Our nerves will be uninsulated, and being uninsulated, they will jangle with cross communications. We'll be unable to store crucial supplies of certain vitamins or even have a functioning immune system. Today is the 8th of May 2021. We will not be able to fight off the COVID-19 virus and the soon coming rat virus, which I'm going to talk about later on, without fat cells. We will not live long. So on a cellular level, fats make the membranes that surround cells possible, and they also act as a messenger that binds to proteins and enables various reactions. So my friend, fat is crucial to our health. So these four cells need energy just to do the basic functions of a cell. And the place that they get that energy from, or the primary source of that energy, is from glucose. Carbohydrates, when you eat them, are broken down in your digestive system into sugar. If you were to actually taste glucose, it will taste sweet, and glucose gets delivered to cells through the blood stream. And inside the blood, we have glucose molecules, right? And so in an ideal situation, when a cell needs energy, glucose will enter that particular cell. So now we have glucose in the blood, we have lots of it. The challenge is it needs to get into our cells. The glucose needs to get into the cells. Unfortunately, it's not that simple for the great majority of cells in the human body. It needs the pancreas on the left hand side here to assist. Your question is, how does that work? So as glucose, a type of sugar, goes into your blood, the pancreas sees the glucose in your blood and needs the assistance of a hormone or a molecule called insulin. So the pancreas then produces the required insulin. So it sends the insulin over to the cells. So insulin, which is a hormone that comes from your pancreas, is a very important part of the whole body. It's very important to your metabolism because it tells your body what to do with the carbohydrates that you actually eat. So basically, when it arrives, insulin then becomes a doorman. Its job is to open up the doors of those cells so that glucose can get in. And this does two things. First of all, it gets rid of excess glucose in your blood. And that is a much desired or desirable state for your body to be. And secondly, it delivers glucose to your cells where it can be stored for energy. So insulin is extremely crucial in moving glucose into the blood cells. Now remember that every chemical, every drug that big pharma makes and sells can only work with your body if there is a natural receptor in the body. And there can only be a natural receptor if the body originally in itself already produces its own natural drug. And we call this agonist and antagonist, which is natural and artificial. So insulin, which is natural as a hormone, has receptors. So the insulin receptors are on the surface of the cells. In this case, they are on all the four cell types that I mentioned earlier on. So what happens is, in order for the glucose to be taken up by the cell, insulin has to attach to these receptors. It has to bind to them, which then unlocks the channels for glucose to be taken up by the cell. And this is a happy day scenario. Now, what can go wrong with this simple insulin scenario? What can go wrong with this perfect supply chain process? Now, unfortunately, things don't always work as planned. Two things could go wrong with this perfect supply chain. I want you to keep those crosses in mind for later. So, scenario one, we have glucose floating by. and then we have our insulin receptors on the surface of the cells. And the pancreas, seeing all that glucose floating around, does what? It sends insulin, or does it? So we have sufficient insulin here, and we have a healthy blood sugar. That's what you can see on the screen. So you're still with me. Now, what if that is not the case? Now, the first thing that could go wrong here is, what if what if the pancreas with the cross on the left does not produce insulin? Then we will have too much blood sugar, and that is not good. Insulin, as mentioned, is produced in and by the pancreas. What happens if the pancreas is not producing insulin properly? What happens? So, no insulin in this scenario. So in this situation, two things happen simultaneously. Since there is nothing to bind to these receptors, the glucose transport channels will not open up, and the glucose will not be able to enter into the cell. And this happens to be type 1 diabetes, where you've got glucose, but you have no insulin. So in theory, you have glucose floating around, you have the energy you need, and you have properly functioning insulin receptors, but you just don't have insulin to unlock the gates for the glucose to actually go into the cell. If we are to go by WHO records, and if we are to trust the records, the number of people with diabetes, I'm not including pre-diabetics, which account for 4 times the confirmed diabetic casualties. So just the pre-diabetic, according to WHO, the number rose from 108 million in 1980 to 550 million in 2020. So a decade ago, precisely in 2010, the global projection for diabetes for 2025 was 438 million. Now, 5 years short of that projection, and the numbers are well over 500, well over 100 million above the projection. We are in a health crisis. This is 2022. I'm not sure which year you are listening to this particular video, but whichever year, we are in a health crisis with insulin insensitivity. So that's the first scenario, where we have insulin, or we have glucose but no insulin. Okay, so the second scenario, okay, that we could imagine happening is that the blood is flowing past the cells. So this is just one of the many trillions of cells that I'm showing you here in the human body. So looking at the second scenario that could happen, the second scenario is that the blood is flowing past the cells. And like I said, this is just one of the many trillions. So, by the way, we have an estimated, it's good to mention that here, we have an estimated 50 to 100 trillion cells, now depending on what science we are listening to. So the cells need glucose. So glucose is again floating by. Okay, we have glucose floating around. There is insulin also around and also present. And the insulin and the glucose are both seeing the insulin receptors and also seeing the glucose channels on the cell. So this is the perfect end scenario that we have here, where the glucose gets into the cells after the insulin triggers open the glass and the glucose transporters. So that's the perfect scenario. Our cells need the energy, as we can see here by the light you see on the bottom just beside the cell. There's that light shining there. That's the energy. We are like a battery. Our cells need the power. So we have glucose, we have the insulin, and the insulin sees the insulin receptors on the cell. I want to emphasize that. This is the second scenario. The glucose waits to get through the glucose transporters. That's the process that needs to be followed. Okay, so in this situation, the receptors are there. The insulin sees the receptors. So now I'm going to move you on to the next scenario, which is what happens in the case where we have the second state of insulin present in the body. So looking at the current scenario, the insulin binds to the receptors, and therefore insulin triggers open the glucose transporters, and the glucose gets into the cells through the glucose transporters, and the movie plot ends perfectly well. Or the question is that, does that happen? So I'm going to repeat myself, but excuse me for repeating myself. So our pancreas is producing insulin and putting it into our bloodstream. Essentially, it is there to be used. Unfortunately, that is not the case. So insulin carries its glucose up to the cell, it knocks on the door, and the door doesn't open. Insulin cannot bind to the insulin receptors, as you can see on the left hand side there. The glucose transporter channels therefore cannot open, and the glucose cannot go into the cell. The receptors are not working properly. They are there, but they're not working properly, and we become what we call insensitive or desensitized to insulin. So the insulin cannot trigger open the channels to take in the glucose through the glucose transporter. So in this second situation, sometimes maybe it might be the insulin is hard to bind to the receptors, or even if it does bind to the receptor, the doorman cannot trigger open the door of the glucose transporter. It's just not working properly, and as a result of that, we have too much glucose in the blood. This is type 2 diabetes. So the glucose will not enter the cell, it just keeps floating around in the cells. This scenario is type 2 diabetes. The body lacks the energy. The insulin is there, but it cannot open the glucose transporter channels. So type 1 diabetes is just to recap, is where we have the glucose, we have we don't have the insulin, and we need more insulin. Type 2 diabetes is where we have the glucose, we have the insulin, we have the body cells that need the energy. However, the doorman cannot open the door to let in the glucose. The insulin receptors are not working. So the above two scenarios that I've taken time to go through, the first one of no insulin, which is type 1 diabetes, and the second one of no insulin receptors, or better put, no insulin receptors working properly, and that is type 2 diabetes. And both paint a very worrying picture, a picture so many are facing and not aware of. This situation that we call insulin resistance. Now, a good friend and an old friend of mine happens to be a medical doctor who channels the transformation in the realm of the mind and the spirit, put it all so well. And I will read one of his quotes where I personally draw inspiration from. He says, God only places prepared people on platforms. And that segues quite well into why I am doing this, and a good place to introduce myself. I am George Mashiko. Professionally, I'm not qualified to dive into a visceral expose on insulin. I'm not a medical practitioner. However, just as my good friend Dr. Shola put it, I'm doing this because I have empathy. I have concern for people's well-being, for the health of our children, of our children's children, to resocialize the thinking. I was borderline diabetic, also called pre-diabetic, without realizing it. I was becoming more insulin resistant. Now I know that being resistant to insulin is a root cause of a myriad of diseases. And this is why I am taking so much time to use this platform to share this information. It amazes me, my friends and family who I get to share my exciting and inspired Moonshot project. They tell me that I'm a psychotic optimist, but I tell them that's okay for as long as it is a communicable disease. Now, this video that I'm putting together is a layman's attempt to explain a complex disease, but I can do that because I walked through that valley. So I haven't taken 20 minutes of your time to explain diabetes type 1 and diabetes type 2, which are both insulin resistance, in as simple a way as I could. That is basically when your cells, to recap, don't respond to insulin like they're supposed to and do not get the glucose. They do not get the sugar. They don't get the energy that the body needs. This situation of insulin resistance creates lots of problems, and I'm going to highlight just 6 problems here, and these are by no means exhaustive. The first is dementia. Now, in this situation, we have excess glucose accumulating in the blood, and that's chronic high blood glucose or prediabetes in itself. Many and various epidemiological evidences have also shown that prediabetes and diabetes are related to higher risk of dementia, in particular Alzheimer's disease, which I call a medically caused disease, of which there is yet no cure. So I've highlighted 11 ways to reduce your risk of dementia. So dementia is the first of 6 problems which insulin resistance can cause. The second is erectile dysfunction. Sugar, if it gets in too high enough a level in the blood, can actually cause a lot of damage if it's in high concentration. Sugar can cause damage to the body. Sugar is a major cause of erectile dysfunction, of low libido in men, and of low sex drive in women. I know this. I walked through that valley before God graced me with a total recovery and reversal regime. I was extremely low on energy. Now, the third is being low on energy, like you can see here. Because your cells don't have their energy source, you end up feeling fatigued and a host of related symptoms. My take is this: do not treat these symptoms, rather treat insulin resistance. In my own case, I had chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, and I had to treat them because they were root causes of whatever illness I had. Now, the fourth is an obvious one. Your general body cells don't function if they are not taking up the required glucose. As you can see here, they are not taking up the required glucose, so the body doesn't function. The fifth is that you crave more carbohydrates because the carbohydrates that are present cannot be seen by the cells. And in that respect, it segues into the sixth, which is weight gain. Weight gain becomes that much easier. Even though 15 to 30% of normal, so-called normal weight adults are also insulin resistant. I was normal weight, but I became pre-diabetic. Now, these are just 6 of the many problems from insulin resistance. Please take a listen out to my podcast on This Is 2021. I've put the link in the description panel below. So, we have painted the 2 possible scenarios, type 1 and type 2, and you don't want any of this happening to you. The body is a remarkable work of art by God. The body wants your cells to have energy and doesn't like the idea of so much sugar floating and flowing in your blood and causing damage to your body. So what does it do? So the pancreas now takes one last ditch effort by trying to increase how much insulin it is sending into the blood to match up all the glucose it sees around. That's what the pancreas does. Now, there are three possible problems with this last ditch effort of the body in its own wisdom. The first problem with this is that now you have high insulin or chronic high insulin state where too much insulin is present in your blood stream. And the second problem with so much insulin in the blood is that it is now that much harder for you to burn fat. And thirdly, and worse still, it also encourages fatty acids that are floating around in the blood to go into fat storage, into fat deposits. So essentially, a whole myriad of things could go wrong by virtue of the fact that you are insulin resistant. And what you see here are by no means exhaustive. But there is good news coming. Insulin resistance can be corrected with three basic recommendations. Just three basic recommendations. Starting with type 1 diabetes. The problem here with type 1 is that there is no insulin in the bloodstream. Okay, so with type 1 diabetes, everything else is working properly. Glucose is available, the insulin receptors are present, the glucose transporters are able to work, just no doorman to open up. There is no insulin to open up the doors. We just have glucose, type 1 diabetes. And there is pretty much just one line of action here. Okay, that is the way the medical fraternity has socialized us. The way that you could manage type 1 diabetes is you inject insulin, because for some reasons your body is not producing insulin. And then you will have insulin to attach to the receptors. Okay, when you do that, you have the insulin, and then the glucose can be processed properly in the cells. Injecting is the only medically provided solution to resolving type 1 diabetes. Now we're good to go with the glucose getting into the cells for energy, and that is type 1 diabetes. Now, type 2 diabetes. The problem here with type 2 diabetes is that there is insulin in the bloodstream. However, the receptors are not working properly. Everything else seems to be working properly. On arriving by the cells, the insulin receptors are not binding. So in this case, there are multiple lines of attack, and we're going to mention 5. 3 of them we subscribe to as natural therapies. These 3 are the ones that can help you reverse your type 2 diabetes in 2 years. In 2 years, you can fix it. I love the number 2, using natural therapies. All type 2 diabetes remedies are done with one objective in mind: to attempt to resensitize your insulin receptors to the sugar that it sees around. So insulin is available in type 2 diabetes. So the first line of attack usually is giving chemical drugs, that could help, and they will hopefully help you to resensitize or make you less desensitized to the actual insulin that is already present in the blood stream. That is the first line of attack, and that is what allopathy recommends: more drugs. Secondly, just as in type 1, it is recommended to inject insulin. So remember, the first line of attack is to take insulin drugs or give chemical drugs. Okay, the second one is to inject insulin. But hold on, are we not getting this wrong here? But we already have insulin here, so why would I add more insulin? I've explained that insulin is actually present, but the receptors are not working. More drugs is an option because, remember, the cells can process insulin, but the receptors are desensitized. So the thinking here is, how about if we put in more insulin in order to uptake the amount, or to uptake the same amount of glucose that is in the blood? So if you add more insulin, you could possibly have enough of a trigger that the excess or the extra insulin will cause the receptors to get sensitized to the plenty insulin and attach the insulin so that the glucose can actually be taken up through the glucose transporter. So this is option 2 of 5 available options in trying to reverse or solve type 2 diabetes. Now, how about our recommendations? We have hope. We have a third, a fourth, and a fifth solution. We'll be extremely intellectual here, and then we will grow to be geniuses. In this tribe, in this journey, we'll be able to reverse insulin resistance. We'll be able to reverse diabetes. So as we introduce the third, fourth, and fifth recommendations, these are recommendations that will definitely work when we change our lifestyle and treat our bodies the way our bodies were made to be treated and catered for. So let us talk now. Let's talk some sense about reversing insulin resistance the natural way. No more toxic big pharma chemicals. Let us talk senses. Let's use 3 natural solutions to fix this insulin resistance issue. And in the process, we will slow down the fast aging process, making us look and feel at least 10 years younger than our biological age, all in the process of reversing insulin resistance. So here comes one of my pitches. Just as I introduced the 3 pills in the Senses Toolbox kit, the ones that we are going to be using to reverse insulin resistance, I need to make mention of a very important statement here. In order to reverse my ill health and restore my health, I met with destiny. I cannot talk about Senses without first briefly mentioning Chinese entrepreneur Mr. Zhu Zuwei. Mr. Zhu Zuwei's deep philosophy gave me the confidence to build the Senses platform. Now I am an ambassador of Senses. I'm obsessed with it. I'm a diplomat. And today we are recommending 3 pills. 3 pills. I developed Senses because pharmacology had failed me. I was getting worse and I needed to change in order to effectively body hack my health, to restore my health. Then came to birth the 9 pills that you can see here. So Senses is our third remedy option to reverse insulin resistance. You need to nutrify yourself. You need to take supplements, infuse your body with antioxidants, take alkaline water, raw food, and minerals. You need to live off these. Possibly, teas should be your lover. And exercise. Do aerobics. Don't go burning yourself out in the gym. It's not necessary. Get your sport and your walking shoes and walk. Become mobile. And then vitamin C, sunshine vitamins. You need more vitamin. Did I say vitamin C? Vitamin D, beg your pardon. So if you are insulin sensitive, this list is by no means exhaustive. We have put together 10 things to do immediately to reverse insulin. Please do watch the podcast. This is 2021. The link is below. Now, the insulin resistance syndrome includes a group of diseases like obesity. I call it diabesity, which is obesity and diabetes. High blood pressure, so-called high cholesterol. There is no such thing. So-called high cholesterol and the notorious type 2 diabetes. Insulin resistance could affect as many as 1 in 3 people, and many people do not know this. You might also hear it called metabolic syndrome. Anyone who has a chronic disease should please consider screening for insulin resistance first. Do a fast insulin test, not an FBS, and that's the fasting blood sugar test. Do a fasting insulin test. So As I close on this podcast, we are here to bust the myth behind high insulin resistance. I would like to drop just one simple suggestion that you can start off immediately. It is a way in which we can help kick off the journey in fixing our insulin resistance. And you can do that immediately till you can view our podcast, which I put in 10 recommendations. We want to leave you with just one simple thing to do. Now, by just changing your carbohydrate choice, you can immediately alter your insulin resistance just by being smart with your carbohydrate choice. Now, think of carbohydrates that are hard to break down. For example, there's a difference between a hard candy and a carrot. You take a hard candy, put it in your mouth, and you don't have to do anything. In a moment, it will dissolve. That will get into your bloodstream very quickly, spiking your insulin. Whereas, compared to a carrot, you put that in your mouth, you have to chew and chew and chew to break that down. That is a choice you need to make to immediately reverse your insulin or stop the process of getting less insulin sensitive. That goes into your bloodstream very slowly when you have a carrot, and gives you a nice steady flow of glucose, which is what you want. Well, that's it for me today. Today is the 9th or the 8th of May 2021. I cannot end without warning us of the pandemic that is worse than the current one that we are experiencing, COVID-19. This radvac should hit us between 2023 and 2025. Please do look out for that podcast. It's in the mail. We are building foundation, and I hope this video gave you more clarity on insulin resistance. We are laying a foundation, and we have scheduled this project, this foundation, as a 5-year project in itself. As we build our library with content, we will take you through journeys in health and wealth, creating stories of and for everyone. We'll be having at least 5 million viewers and listeners and 550,000 organic tribe and community members by 2026. I hope that this video was helpful. If you found it helpful, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. The arrow is pointing down there. Share this podcast, comment, and please do set on the notification button so you will get the podcast as I drop them. Please do check in the description panel below for the podcast on which I've called Disease 2021. It's 20 diseases, 2 years to fix, 1 root cause. Also, I'll put a link to a podcast titled 3 Simple Things to Do to Fix Insulin. Also, another link which is titled to a podcast titled Drink Yourself Out of Insulin Resistance. And the 5th one I'm going to put will be called 5 Nutrients to Master Our Insulin Sensitivity. Also, other podcasts I'm going to drop to help us become insulin sensitive. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and have a healthy and a wealthy day. And of course, I can't stop without saying this. Have an insulin sensitive day. God bless. I'm out of here.